than I did. If I eat less meat, will I get enough protein?
A very common myth is you can't get enough protein from vegetable foods. That's entirely untrue. And you know, if you look back at the scientific studies done over the last 50 years, they clearly show that for human needs, vegetable proteins are superior. As a matter of fact, I'd challenge any dietitian to try and design me a diet that was protein deficient based around any starch and any vegetables. You can't do it.
How much protein do we need each day? About 50 grams is the amount recommended by the U.S. government. But the average person in this country eats 200% of that amount.
I think that as far as protein intake in the United States is concerned, we're simply consuming too much, particularly too much animal protein, and we really need to seriously take into consideration the possibility of cutting down on the intake of this nutrient.
You know, in our society, people believe that diseases are due to deficiencies. I mean, after all, look at what people are doing. They're, worried about getting enough protein. They're taking handfuls of vitamin pills and mineral pills. I mean, think about it for a minute. How many people do you know who have deficiency diseases? Scurvy, beriberi, pellagra? Any of your friends go to the doctor for a protein deficiency this year? That's not where the problem is. The problem isn't here in terms of deficiency. The problem is over here in terms of excess. Anybody have any friends with problems of excess, like excess calories, excess fat, excess cholesterol? This is where the problem is, not over here. Until you start looking in this direction, you won't have the answer to America's health problems.
Because he believes that food is so fundamental to his patients' health, Dr. McDougall takes the time to teach them new ways to cook. I asked the patients what it was like to change their diet.
My diet before, if you heard me tell you what my daily diet was, you would just sit there and go, oh my God, it was mostly fat.
Usually my habit was I'd have bacon and eggs in the morning, okay? And while I'm finishing them off, I'm wondering what I'm going to have for lunch. And while I'm eating lunch, I say, I wonder what we're going to have for supper. We're going to have that big steak and all that. And I couldn't understand why. It was always gloggy.
Constantly seeing the doctors and having them tell me that I wasn't responding and there was not much hope for my condition.
My patients come to the clinic sick because they've been feasting 21 times a week. As a result, they have diseases of kings and queens. When you stop the cause of an illness, then they have a chance to recover.
I lost 36 pounds. My cholesterol went down to 152.
I feel like $1,000,000, and I feel that there's nothing today that I cannot do.
I feel great, and the reason I'm saying that is because all of those symptoms went away.
Well, I've lost weight, which is great. And, I used to be a chronic dieter with diet pills and all kinds of the latest, the diet thing to do. And now I can eat just like I've always wanted to eat all my life.
And when they learn this very simple message, that you get some exercise, you get proper rest, and you eat the right kinds of foods.
I'm just living, Eddie. That's all I can tell you. You can't be any nicer than that. I'm not going to die, period.
You feel tightness and heaviness? Pains going down your arm?
Several years ago, Carl Parise suffered a heart attack.
I'll be honest with you, at that point, I just figured I'd die on the operating table.
It happens in our country every 32 seconds. The great irony is that in the so-called poor countries, the major diseases that kill us are relatively rare. And people in developing countries are beginning to worry that they could become too much like us.
There is a growing concern that more and more people in the third world are going to the McDonald's chain. Because if we look at the diet of young people in my country today, young children, teenagers, they are beginning to eat more hamburgers as a meal, eating a lot more meat. Eating Western-style meals is becoming very popular among the people who can afford it. And this means that eventually, the meat, which was a garnishing or a small part of a big meal, becomes the main course. The same size piece of meat on the plate for one person here would be really cut up into a meal for 5 people at home.
Our agriculture today has to produce twice as much meat per person as it did in 1900. As I traveled across the country, I thought about everything I'd learned. And I realized I wanted to know more about what we eat. I wanted to look behind the scenes at how our food is produced.
For most of the year, they graze on the hillside.
I realized that my pictures of farm animals had come from childhood.
This is a dairy cow and her young calf.
Those peaceful pictures of contented cows.
They need to eat plenty of rich grass.
In real life, I learned there is a strong bond between a newborn calf and its mother. Other cows always seem to show a strong interest in the new calf.
But it's a good, healthy baby bull.
Dairyman John Schoneveld was proud to show me the newest addition to his herd.
Unfortunately, it's a bull. If it was a heifer, I would keep it.
Will he be allowed to nurse, or will he be?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, he will be allowed to nurse. He will stay with his mother tonight, and then tomorrow morning he will be picked up by a broker, which takes him to a place where they raise him.
Are they raised, some of them for veal? Some of
Yes,
them
some are raised for veal.
If a calf born at a dairy is a male, he will often be taken from his mother within a day. Some will be chained at the neck and will live in a cramped space for the remainder of their short lives.
It is the ultimate. There is none finer. It's tender, delicious, succulent. You can almost cut it with your fork. Here is an incredibly popular dish in the finer restaurants. It's called osso buco. It's the veal shank. They raise the animal in a very special way so that you can have this incredible delicacy.
If an animal is seldom allowed to move, its muscles remain weak and soft.
The muscles of the animal are tender, very pasty. Notice the pale white color, the milky fat.
We pay extra for it. We pay a premium price for it because we're taught to believe that lighter meats are healthier. Pigs have always been a favorite animal of mine. They're playful, sensitive, and affectionate. They have a close family life, and in some ways they're actually more intelligent than dogs. I used to think that pigs were still raised like this, outdoors, in a pleasant barnyard. But this farm, photographed 40 years ago, is a historical relic. Hogs are raised very differently now. To be competitive, farmers have to crowd the maximum number of animals into the smallest possible space. And there they live their whole lives. Pigs have strong natural instincts: rooting, nest building, caring for their young. But in confinement, these strong drives are blocked. And as a concerned citizen, someone who wants my life to be a statement of compassion in some respect for the world, when I see what's done to the animals, it makes me look at my food choices in a whole new way. I have to question, is this what I want my contribution to the world to involve? Today's chickens aren't in barnyards anymore. They aren't scratching around on the earth and pecking away and looking up at the sun and doing the things that chickens have done for millions of years. The layer hens are kept crammed into these cages so tightly they can't even lift a wing. These are birds that have a strong territorial impulse. And so they have a pecking order normally, which they create by spatially orienting themselves. But they can't do that because they're crammed together so tightly. So the result is their instinct causes them to peck at each other constantly. Now, the industry responds to this by cutting off parts of their beaks. It's called debeaking. It's standard operating procedure in the industry today. And the only result of that is they continue to peck, but they can't kill each other in the process.
The poultry industry is a good example where we may have a building that has 100 or 200,000 chickens that are very closely put together. Now, the people who raise the chickens are basically economic creatures. They are responding to the market demand for cheap chicken. And I think that traditionally the humane aspects really didn't even enter the equation. I think the idea was to produce chicken cheaply.
Now, one of the other ways that the industry responds to the overcrowding and the stress and the birds' reactions to it is by feeding them antibiotics.
Well, in a chicken house where you have 200,000 birds, an outbreak of a disease can kill all the birds in a very short period of time. Therefore, you need biosecurity. You need to make sure that the animals have antibiotics to fend off even the smallest infection.
The antibiotics that are fed to livestock are very potent drugs, and residues of these substances are frequently found in meats and dairy products. No one is certain as to the effect that these drugs have in the human body, but it's a very worrisome thing to consider when you sit down and have your lunch.
There's an acceptable level that's set by the federal government, and I assume that this is all right. The problem is you have some people who are irresponsible, and they use the drugs indiscriminately, many times not under veterinary supervision, and then we find huge residue levels.
And if the chickens have been poisoned and if the chickens have been treated so obscenely, then what is it that we're doing to ourselves in the process? And every time I returned home, I tried to understand the meaning of what I was learning. And I found myself remembering Chief Seattle. About 100 years ago, he was the chief of a northwestern Indian tribe, Native American tribe. At the time when his people had to leave their lands and go to a reservation, very sad. I'm sure you know the story, you know, of how the white men moved across the continent and what occurred. Very tragic. And this was a poignant and pathetic time. And he made a speech. And he said something remarkable that always lived in me. And he said, all right, we'll go. I mean, they had tried everything else. They'd fought, they had run away, they had done everything, but they had to, it was die or go to the reservation. So he said, okay, we'll go. But, he said, I ask one thing in return from the great chief in Washington. That's how he put it. Now, what do you think he asked for? What would you have asked for? When I put myself in his shoes, I think maybe I would have asked for additional horses or blankets or food for the journey. No, he asked something very different. He said, what we really want, the one thing we ask, is that the white man treat the animals of this land as his brothers, as part of his family. Now, why did he ask that? I think I know. And I think he looked at us, he looked at the white man, and he saw our profound alienation, our separation from life, how disassociated we'd become. He saw the war taking place in our lives against nature, against the environment, against each other, against his people, against ourselves. Endlessly, repetitively, dangerously, disastrously. And he wanted to heal us. I think because for Chief Seattle and his people, to some extent anyway, life itself was sacred. And the sound of the birds singing in the trees were like a choir, and the forests were the cathedrals, and breathing was an act of prayer. We are so interconnected that what we do to the environment and to the other life forms that live in it becomes our own fate. I remember how shocked I was the first time I saw a feedlot. It was a vivid experience of how the food that we choose profoundly affects the environment. When we think of cattle, most of us picture John Wayne and the open range where the cattle eat grass. As early as 6 or 8 months of age, thousands of cattle are brought together to be confined and fattened. A feedlot is an assembly line for producing meat. Feeding grains instead of grass produces meat with the fat and the marbling that Americans have come to prefer. The modern feedlot often produces something else.
The
total livestock population in the United States outweighs the human population by 4 times. And they produce an enormous amount of manure, 1.6 billion tons. This is the equivalent of about 6,000 pounds of manure per person in the United States coming directly from livestock.
One of the things that's happened is that the waste that results from a feedlot, for example, of say 20,000 animals, can end up being as much waste as the whole city of Albuquerque. Unfortunately, the cattle don't pay for sewer hookups, so what happens is the waste goes into the ground or into the groundwater or into the surface streams, waste that can be destructive and harmful.
I remembered the dairy that I visited earlier, where I saw the newborn calf.
When they're born, you want to make sure that you get their mouth and their...
John Schoneveld told me that he's worried about the huge mountains of cow manure piling up all around him.
I'm worried about stockpiles of fertilizer in this valley, because when the wind blows, the fertilizer also blows. And we are very sensitive about our sanitation and keeping a clean product. All of our cows are washed daily, every time they're milked. From the wash pen, we get a lot of washed manure. That's the water that runs off of the animal after the manure has been washed off of them. It's a major problem because the water has to saturate down into the ground, and there's a fear that we are putting those nitrates down to the drinking water level.
When a dairy is surrounded by farms, the manure may be useful to neighbors. But when cities grow up all around, the manure can become a menace.
The Water Quality Control Board came out and tested our water, and they said it was contaminated with nitrates. And we were like really shocked. And then we started wondering about the health effects for our children.
Carol Close and her family live near another dairy in Southern California. She wonders whether her child's birth defects could have been caused by nitrates in the water. Research suggests that nitrates may be the cause of serious medical problems.
Nitrates in the drinking water can be a serious threat. Little babies drinking water contaminated with nitrates can actually turn blue because the nitrate combines with the hemoglobin in their blood that carries oxygen, and the babies are unable to get oxygen to their tissues. And the so-called blue baby syndrome can be damaging or even lethal for a small infant.
And it turns out that nitrates could be passed through in breast milk.
What I saw was a situation in which everyone was frustrated.
I wondered about if my children had experienced any loss of oxygen to their brain that could hurt their development, their mental development. I worried about problems that might come up in the future. I worried about my neighbors who were still drinking the water after they found out it was contaminated, and I worried if they would get, cancer.
We're looking at cleanup costs that are going to be somewhere between $70 and $100 million to clean up this groundwater basin here.
I worried about everybody in our town that never had their water tested. And I worried that they would never know.
I was amazed to learn that not only by making wise food choices do I improve the quality of my own health, but also I improve the quality of our water. What we eat collectively has an incredible impact on our resources, particularly our water. The more I learned, the more connections I saw, the more I began to imagine what could happen if we ate a little less meat.
Okay, how many of you here like mathematics?
Yes.
As I became aware of the threat that our animal-based diet posed not only to our health, but to our environment, I began to study more, and I was often asked to address groups, including schools.
Okay, I want you to imagine that you are marooned all by yourself on a desert island. It's just you, and you are responsible for growing your own food. So with a lot of hard work and plowing and working in the fields, you are able to produce for yourself 12 pounds of grain. Okay, now I just happen to have for you here 12 pounds of grain. If it was 12 pounds of corn, what could you make out of it? Rebecca?
Cornflakes.
Out of 12 pounds of corn, you could make 54 bowls of cornflakes. And what if the grain you were growing was wheat? What can you make out of wheat?
Bread.
Bread. Out of 12 pounds of wheat, you could make about 12 loaves of bread. That would last you almost 2 weeks. Now, suppose instead of eating these grains in the form of spaghetti or cereals or bread, you want to add to your diet meat. Now, how are you going to convert your grain into meat?